The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Personal Experience and Pool. Now this is going to be a really curious video because people are going to be like, hang on, why are you talking about pool? I'm not just talking about pool. Some of you may know, years ago when I was much younger, I played what would be arguably semi-pro pool, or at least I played at a level where I could compete against really good players and could also pay my rent playing pool, pocket billiards. And I love games like that. I love all games. I'm a big gamer. There's a whole board game collection downstairs. Recently, some of you might have seen me talking about the crokinole board that we got for the ACA. I'm practicing up so that I can go play in the World Championships, even though I have no real hope of winning. But I love those types of things. From the very first time I think I encountered a pool table in the basement of a friend's house, I really liked it. There's a strong math component to it. Recently on the Atheist Experience, I mentioned Donald in Math Magic Land, or Donald Duck in Math Magic Land, which I think you can just watch on YouTube, but it features the math of pool. But it struck me the other day, all the years that I spent playing, and the years I've spent watching other people learn and play similar games, we see the same trends happening over and over and over. And it is this reliance on personal experience that leads us to the wrong understanding and the wrong conclusion. And it doesn't just apply in the realm of pool and sports and games. It applies in our life in general. But it struck me that pool, along with several others, is one of the few areas where we can actually show that our reliance on personal experience is fundamentally flawed. So what do I mean by fundamentally flawed? When you first start learning a game like pool, and I'll stick with pool, you can substitute in your own things that you might have more experience with, you don't know what you're doing. And so it becomes a process that is a little bit more trial and error. I'm going to strike the ball in this way, and I'm going to move my arm in this way. We're going to do things until it works, and then when it works, we make the mistake of thinking that we've come to an understanding of how and why it works. And so anybody who's spent any time in a pool hall will watch players. There's a lot of different terminology. I will try not to use too much jargon, but you can, by where the tip of the stick hits the cue ball, you can impart spin to the cue ball. You can impart forward or backward spin or roll, and then you can impart left spin or right spin in varying degrees of each of that. You could hit it, top right, and you would add forward spin and some right spin. The left-right spin in the United States is called English, so my friends in the UK will snicker a little at that, I'm sure. But when the player does something extra with their body, it is often referred to as body English. And so, he'd really put a little extra body English on that. Or what you'll see people end up doing is, instead of positioning themselves and working in a straight motion, they'll start swinging their hand around at different things, or moving their hips, or they'll line the tip of the cue stick up with a certain spot on the ball, but when it comes time to actually strike the ball, they'll hit at a different thing. This is fairly common. Some people are conscious of these adjustments. I think they're a mistake. Personally, for me, you should do all your prep strokes at the exact same spot that you're planning to hit it anyway. But some people think that, if I start by aiming at the top of the ball and then on the final stroke I lower it down and go to the bottom ball, that keeps me straight. I don't understand that, because you're moving your bridge hand and things like that. But it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter to the individuals who are playing, because if it works, that's all that counts. And so if I make the shot, I must have done something right. The problem here is that none of us are particularly good measuring devices. We are certainly not unbiased. And if you keep going with, I did this last time and it worked and I do it again, over and over again, then when you miss, you no longer know why. And you're reluctant to believe the facts when they're presented to you. What we know about spin on a cue ball or an object ball, and how it impacts the game, is that forward and backward roll affect what happened to the cue ball after it comes in contact with an object ball, because the cue ball comes in contact with an object ball and it leaves along the tangent line unless it has forward roll or backward roll to control how it diverges from the tangent line of the contact point between the balls. And the amount of left or right spin that's on there doesn't really affect that in any significant way. So as long as you hit it dead center, you put a much right or left English on it, and basically you just have a ball spinning there like a top, still straight along that tangent line. Similarly, when the cue ball or an object ball that is spinning hits a rail, it's the side spin that controls how it comes off the rail. This should intuitively make sense to people, because if you think about it, the table is at this plane, and so it's the spin that is going either against the friction on the surface or with it that will control which way it moves there. And rails are vertical, so it will be the horizontal spin that is working in opposition to the point of contact on there. I bought this book in the early 90s. It's called The Science of Pocket Billiards. It's a great book because it is a walkthrough of everything that they could do about pool, the equipment they made in order to consistently get the same results over and over again, the ability to make sure that these balls were lined up in the same way so that we could repeatedly test for results. If you just put spots on the table and you're trying to manipulate them by hand and by eye, there's going to be slight variances. You can't realistically have a human being hit a cue ball and reliably produce the same speed and spin over and over again. It's incredibly difficult to do. Yes, the pros are incredibly good at making shots, about maintaining trajectory. They're incredibly good at controlling speed so that they could, go 5 rails around the table and stop on, a playing card. That's really high fidelity, and those are mostly people who've learned kind of through trial and error. It's, I'm going to do this until it works, and then I practice and you build up muscle memory. But if you're doing testing, you don't want to rely on that. You don't want to rely on fallible human beings if there's a mechanical method for that. So one of the things he did was he built ramps that would have stop blocks at different locations, so that if you release the stop block, the ball falls from the same height, and so its acceleration due to gravity is pretty constant, and you can consistently get the same roll. And that's one of the ways that you can actually test things. So he goes through in this book, and it's in great detail, and it covers all kinds of wonderful things, and dispels a great many myths about pool, about what happens with balls of spin, what are the angles, when we're learning how to do bank shots around the table, what are we looking for? How many different systems are there to do bank shots? Are we going to use a mirrored table system? Are we going to use the diamond system? Are we going to have various tracks? Things that were known and discovered. But at the end of the day, the truth is that everything about pool is math. It's physics and geometry. It is the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. However, that can change, because when we're coming off of a side rail, what we have is rubber that's covered in cloth. And so the ball can sink into that rail, and that can affect whether or not it gets additional spin, whether or not it grips and comes off at a different angle. But all of that is testable. The reason I bring all this up is that you can take a pool player who is dedicated to learning pool, loves the game. They've been learning since they were a kid, and they know what works because they do it and it works. And when you tell them what the actual physics of the game dictate, they will refuse to accept it because it conflicts with their experience. It conflicts with what they think their experience is. Because you'll be standing at the table and you'll watch guys complain. Oh, there's no way that happened. No, I hit that in exactly the right spot, and there had to be something on the table, some bit of fuzz, some little gust from the gods, something weird, or there's a chip on the ball somewhere. And the reason they'll go through all those is because they're all, well, somewhat all, plausible. Maybe there is an imperfection on the ball that affected that particular shot. Maybe there's not. But as long as that remains a possible explanation for why they missed, they don't have to face the fact that perhaps they made the error, that what they've learned over all these years and how things actually work may not be something that they're putting into practice appropriately. How do you make sure that your cue is contacting the cue ball at the exact right angle? And does the angle of your butt, the butt of the stick, the angle of that the cue ball is attacking, or the cue stick is attacking the cue ball, does that make a difference? Of course it does, because we know about jump shots. We know about masse shots, where you can impart so much curve that the ball can basically do nearly a U-turn, or in some cases go forward and then come straight back. We're not machines that are calibrated to be able to accurately assess our own actions. And so we would better be described as wonderfully accurate approximators. And so when I'm at the table and I think I've hit the ball exactly right and the shot failed, because I understand the science of pocket billiards, I no longer spend my time looking around for where the errors are on the table. Is there a small bit of piling on the cloth? I will look for that. I'll worry about imperfections in the ball, or maybe these balls aren't as good a quality. Maybe these aren't the Belgian Aramith balls that I'm used to. The speed of the cloth can differ, whether you're using Simonis 760 or whatever. Perhaps the table manufacturer, the competition between Brunswick and Diamond, and whose rails have more give or whose rails have more grip. What about the imperfections in the cue? We've paid ridiculous amounts of money for cue sticks, and you buy a $1,000 pull cue and then you put a $400 special low deflection shaft on it because marketing has convinced you that somehow or another the deflection that might happen after you contact the cue ball and after the cue ball is no longer touching your cue tip can affect what happens with the ball afterwards. There's proper scientific tests we can use. Now let's move away from pool for a second. How many times have we found ourselves relying on this method of inference and induction? Today is pretty much the same as yesterday. I did this yesterday and it worked, so of course it should work today. And what we didn't realize is that there was something different about those two that was either imperceptible to us or that we failed to notice. How many times can you dunk a basketball in a row before your legs are exhausted and now all of a sudden you're weaker? Did you do the same thing in every single one of those? Is every single attempt identical? They're not. And we fundamentally all know that they're not. And yet we act as if they are. And the most dangerous thing about all this is something that I already mentioned, that when somebody comes to you with the evidence, comes to you with, here's the science of pocket billiards, here's the test methodology, here's what actually happens with cut-induced throw versus spin-induced throw, and how negligible is that? How much can you cheat a pocket? And does what you did with your butt, your little butt waggle, does that have anything to do with how much you can cheat a pocket? Is this bank shot makeable? Is it always a double kiss? Is there some type of hit that you can put on the cue ball to where you can get out of that double kiss? If we all properly understood the science, we still wouldn't be the best pool players on the planet, because understanding the science doesn't mean that you can actually execute the shots. And this is the big problem here, in that we are always going to be prone to rely more on our flawed understanding of our own execution than we are on the scientific facts if they seem to conflict with what our execution does. And we do that because our brains are geared to keep doing what works and not necessarily to seek out, is there a better way, or am I misunderstanding this? This is why when people call into the show and they talk about their personal experience, or when I'm engaged with an apologist who wants to give his personal testimony, those things carry little to no weight with me. And they shouldn't carry weight with anybody else, including the person who's offering them. Because we might on occasion, do a pretty good job of knowing ourselves. People all the time will try to tell me, oh, well, I've discovered this about you, Matt. You're this and that. You're thus and so. And on some occasions, they've been right. On some occasions, they've seen things about me that I was incapable of seeing about myself. And in other cases, they're wrong, and what they're engaged in is a sort of projection, where they're seeing what they want to see, or they're coming up with a sort of butt-wiggling excuse. Oh, well, you're just angry, and you're angry because of this, or you're angry because of that. And so when people call in, and I remember Ray Comfort and I had a conversation years ago where he pointed out that I could no more convince him that God wasn't real than I could that his wife wasn't real, because he had had personal experience with both of them. Now, certainly for believers, that's a powerful statement. And for people who aren't necessarily prone into digging in analytically, that's a powerful statement. You couldn't convince me that, well, maybe you could. Maybe there is some set of evidence that you could present to me to show that my wife doesn't exist, or actually, now that I'm no longer married, my wife didn't exist. Because I don't pretend to be absolutely certain about anything. Maybe I'm in a matrix, maybe I'm not, maybe there's some way to demonstrate that, maybe there's not. But we do a lot on the Atheist Debates Project and out in the debating world, engaging in an academic exercise where we present arguments and we look for valid and sound arguments, and we point out fallacies. Sometimes we're doing that to people who don't understand what a fallacy is or why it matters. Why on earth should I care if it's a fallacious argument? Why should I care if my analogy is flawed, if it gets me where I want to go? We deal with this all the time. And when it gets to personal experience, it's very difficult, because if somebody believes that they were in church, they were singing, they had this feeling of elation, the hairs stood up on the back of their neck and their arms and whatever else, and they felt rapturous joy, and everyone around them has convinced them this is the presence of the Holy Spirit, how do you convince them that it wasn't? It's very difficult. You can come up and point out that these are natural responses that the body has to certain situations, certain music, certain feelings, so all of these things. And you can point out that we don't understand it fully. And the closest, for some people, the closest they could ever get is, well, you can't prove them wrong. And you're right, because you probably have an unfalsifiable belief. Now, when I talk about personal experiences as it relates to pool, I'm not talking about things like lucky socks. Like, I wore these socks and I won, so I'm going to keep wearing these socks. That's a superstition that doesn't get to the mechanics of the game. The body English that people put on there, or the misconceptions they have about what the cue ball is going to do in certain situations, that's real. That's what matters. Because what's probably happening is when someone misunderstands the physics of pocket billiards, but still successfully executes shots, even though they're making a mistake, even though they're doing something in a way where it shouldn't work, they are probably compensating in another area. Perhaps they're adjusting how hard they hit with relation to how much spin they're putting on the ball. Perhaps they don't really understand that the cue ball's deflection, once it gets past a certain point, when the cue stick hits it, that the cue ball will not travel along that straight line, but will start to skip off away from the cue stick. And so instead, they are automatically adjusting their aim just slightly, so that instead of aiming straight at the ball, they're going to aim slightly off to the left, and their mishit, their inaccurate hit, is going to correct for the aim. But it's easier if you actually know how it works. And that's why if you load it up like a virtual pool simulation game on a PC that's operating just with straight up physics, you can produce shots that you can replicate over and over and over again. And don't even get me started on what happens when you rack up 15 balls in a triangle and you're absolutely convinced that all the balls are touching all the other balls, which is almost never the case. And they're almost never sitting on exactly the same position, even when you've worn out some of the cloth so that some of them are going to fall into a little divot there. There's a reason that we play the game. And it's because it seems to be unpredictable, and yet we're trying to beat that by making our predictions. The same is true with life. You can't have an accurate understanding, an accurate model of everything about the world, and yet we're really, really good at making predictions. But the other thing that we're really good at, like any pool player that learned to compensate for their own flawed understanding of the game, is we're good at rationalizing the things that don't make sense. We're so uncomfortable with the fact that we might not know, or that we could perhaps be wrong, that we convince ourselves that something else is going on. The little things that we convince ourselves are going wrong eventually add up to bigger and bigger things. And then you get to the sort of people who are like, there are spirits, there are ghosts here, and they're manipulating the balls. There's a God here who's willing the balls to do something other than physics. It would be interesting if a religion ever rose out of that sort of mindset within pool, because now we would have actual testable claims. We would be able to slow down and say, okay, point to the spot on the cue ball where you think the cue tip hit. And then with high definition cameras and slow motion, we could show that isn't necessarily accurate. Point along the line of centers that you think you were aiming at. We can show that that's not actually where they aimed. Because as soon as somebody demonstrates that something other than the laws of physics are governing pool, now we've opened up all sorts of things. But in day-to-day life, in day-to-day conversations, we do the same thing. We do the same thing when we're driving. We do the same thing when we're walking around. We do the same thing in conversations with people where we assume that the words we're using are understood in the same way by the other person that we understand them, even when we know fundamentally that's not the case. And so I guess the lesson is, especially if you're not the type of person who's interested in taking up pool and learning the actual physics behind it, which I would highly recommend, as it's educational. It's probably a better way to learn geometry and math than we're teaching in most schools. And you can go watch Donald in Math Magic Land for a quick look into that. But we need to get better at exercising a little bit of humility, recognizing that the assumptions we make about how we are doing things, including how we are thinking about things day to day, may be wrong. That we almost certainly have biases, that we almost certainly have flawed understandings of things. I've probably made, let's say, 4 or 5 mistakes about the physics of pool just in the process of preparing to do this particular video. Recognizing that and getting used to the idea that it's not the end of the world to be wrong, and that discovering that when you are wrong, you get to change your view of something and you no longer have to remain wrong. That's a wonderful thing. That's what science is all about. And I went with pool, partially because of that book, partially because I love it, and partially because it is physics. It is predictable. And yet the mystical things that people think that they can do to a cue ball by wiggling their butt or how they stand or anything else, that is a small example of what happens on a big scale when we look around at the world we don't understand and assume that there are mystical forces, supernatural forces outside of space and time controlling the world that we live in. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.